Hey there, everybody, and welcome to What's on Your Workbench. This is episode number 7. Music. Hey there, everybody. My name is Chili. This is What's on Your Workbench, and with me, as always, is the incomparable Andrew. Andrew, how are you doing today?
I am doing great. It's early in the morning. I've been for my run. I usually wake up to do this podcast and it's like, oh, I don't want to go for my run. But then I get back and I'm like, let's do this. I'm like super excited. It's the end of my week, one more day of work. And yeah, highlight of my week is getting to chat to you about the random projects that are sitting on my workbench and on yours. So good. How are you been?
Hold on, your audio just cut out for me.
Well, apologies for that. I think we just had a small audio glitch. Excuse the poor audio on Chili's side. He's on speakers today, but it's the world of Zoom, so we all understand what poor audio is like, and I think we can all get through it. So, Chili, how have you been, and how are you going?
I'm doing just fine and dandy. It's been a slew of project after project around here, so I'm happy.
Awesome. That's how you want it to be until you get too many projects, and then you're like, I've got no time. Which is I'm slowly descending into that, and I'm like, pull yourself up. This is just fun stuff. You don't actually need to do any of this, but I want to do it all. And yeah, we'll talk about managing projects. I think one episode, because there's a lot going on there when you try to juggle, life and a hobby and other things. So, but no, that's great to hear you're busy. I can't wait to hear what you've been working on. So, shall we jump right
Yes,
into it?
yes. Speaking of what we've been working on, Andrew, what is on your workbench?
Well, currently what's on my workbench is actually a bunch of painting and stuff, but we're not actually going to talk about that today. I'm actually testing out the kit that I made the other day, or we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So, but that's working out fine. But what I actually wanted to talk about today was a different project. So, as this story develops about my character, there's a trend that you will have noticed that I enjoy a hobby per se, but rather than actually doing the thing, I prefer making things around the hobby. And so one of those things is board games. I enjoy playing board games, but I especially enjoy making things for board games. So this has ranged from actually making complete board games that we like and we've seen, and it's actually surprisingly difficult to make it cheaper than what you can buy it, but we won't get into that. Then there's like instruction manuals. So for games where there's like multiple expansions, sometimes you've got like 5 different instruction manuals all sitting in one, and it gets really confusing. And so I search online, find instructions, print them off and bind them and put them into a book. And I think next week I might talk a little bit about book binding for a related thing. But yeah, so for this week, I actually wanted to talk about an extremely odd problem I had, and it took me a really long time to solve. And I don't think I am 100% with the solution, but I think it'll work. So, have you ever played the game Quirkle?
No.
No. So this is a great game, especially for younger kids, like 5 or 6. Like they can understand it, and the basic concept is like Scrabble. So you're making lines across and up, but you're not doing it with letters. You're doing it with symbols and colors. So what you do is you have 6 different symbols, 6 different colors, and there's 3 of each of those tiles. For those of you that are watching, here's an example of what that might look like. There we go. If my contrast is going to work, maybe I should pick a dark color. And so like for this set, I've got like a circle, a star, a heart, a square, a triangle, and then like a flower shape. And then you've got 6 different colors. So like black, gray, red, blue, green, yellow, whatever. And so we were introduced to this game a couple of years ago, and it was at somebody's house. And I was just like, you know what? I think I can make that. That's not too difficult. And so I ended up having some legs off of a old diaper stand table thing for when we had one of our kids. It was something we used to put the diapers / nappies or whatever you call them on. and we no longer needed it. So I had these nice square pieces of wood. So I believe I just did this with a jigsaw because that was the only saw I had at the time. And I just kind of like sliced it all up. So for those of you that can't see, it's about 1.5 by 1.5 by about 1/4 inch thick, kind of square. And then on the vinyl cutter that I have, just cut out all the shapes on 6 different colors. And then I ended up making a nice bag for it because, you know, you got to have a nice bag. And, you know, everything was great. But for those of you that have played a game like this or played a game with any kind of tiles, is you want something to stand them on so that, you know, you can see them easily and your other people can't see them and you're not knocking them over. So for the longest time, what we did is we just grabbed the holder from our Scrabble game and just used that. But this game, you can obviously have like 6 or so players, and we only had 4 for the Scrabble. And, you know, I kind of wanted this set to be all stuff that I'd made. So that was my problem, was how to make a tile holder with all the tools I had. So this took me on a bit of a journey because originally I was like, maybe I can just find a router bit at the local hardware store. Because growing up, my parents' game of Scrabble, they had these like nice, I think it was just like an oak, and it had been clearly machined into a set shape. You know, it had a bit of an angle, had a bit of a round curve part, and the tiles would sit on there, and then they'd obviously just been sliced. So, you know, I went to the local hardware store, couldn't find any router bits that were even close to the right shape. So I kind of went back to the drawing board and I went, well, maybe with the various routers I've got, maybe I can do like a few different cuts on like a nice square piece of wood and do that. And that kind of worked. So here, for those that can't see, it's basically a long piece of wood that I've tried to get some various angles on, and it just wasn't working. So the solution I ended up coming with was to use some thin plywood. So I'll show you this profile on. And for those of you that can't see, basically it's 3 pieces of, what is that, 4mm plywood. And basically it makes like an L shape. So imagine an L, and then there's like kind of a sticky bit out just above. So it's not a T, but it looks like one of the edges of the T's has dropped. So obviously that will make it sit on an angle. And then I just basically, once I had the rough shape, I went through and I pin nailed it. So to get to my final shape, I ended up having a few prototypes. So the first prototype I had like a piece of dowel to try and get it to be on an angle. I even tried vacuum forming it over the top of this to try and get that shape using a vacuum form with a thin piece of ABS plastic, I think it was, but we won't get into vacuum forming because that didn't work. And then I ended up going for like a slightly bigger prototype. So basically I was working my way down to the dimensions that I wanted. And so you can see with the tile sitting on that, you know, it's too big. Well, it's not too big. It's just by the time I try and fit it in the bag, I want it to be as compact as possible. And then ultimately I came up with the dimensions like that. And so I haven't actually tested this out in game. Again, I'm not 100% happy with it. Sometimes it does have a tendency to tip down onto the flat, but I'm excited to try it. And I think if I do have some issues, I can come along and just kind of sand a bit of an angle on it, and just to kind of enhance that sitting with the way it wants to sit. So yeah, and then to finish it, all I did was hit it with some green spray paint that I had. And then I actually just went over the top with some sandpaper to just kind of give it a bit of a distressed look. Left the edges clean just because I kind of thought that might be a cool look. And it's surprisingly strong. Given that it is just some wood glue and some 23 gauge pins, it's actually, you know, you can't really break it. I mean, I'm sure if you hit it with a hammer, you could, but I'm quite impressed with how that actually all came together. So yeah, that's what I've been working on. Like I said, still need to trial it, but yes, overall it does pretty good. And so the nice thing about this is that I could make just one big continuous strip and then just cut them to the length that I needed. And then I was good to go. I didn't have to, individually manufacture all these different things. I could just make one big long strip, cut it all up, and then off I went. So Chili.
Interesting. I love the prototyping process. I think that's one thing where there's a lot of overlap between pretty dedicated makers. I'm not going to say necessarily every maker, but folks who take it pretty seriously, like yourself, and craft workers. Is, people think that, oh, you just made this, like you knew exactly what to do and you just made this, and that's not the case. As a craft worker, I'm constantly taking scraps of the wood I'm going to be working with and trying out my joinery, or if I have an idea of how to do something that I haven't done it before, like I'm constantly testing that out on the materials I'm going to be using, to fine tune that and to make sure that when I get it done on the final project, it's right the first time. There's a lot of work that goes into that kind of prototyping and trial. And it looks like you had a really methodical approach to that.
I wouldn't call it methodical. It was really just getting desperate because I just couldn't get it to work. The dimensions just weren't working out. I couldn't get consistent. And I mean, I have to agree, like you really notice your step up in your game when you start being willing to prototype. So I famously, or to myself at least, I hate prototyping. I hate making things twice. It's that idea of, oh, I just made it, so now I need to remake it. But as soon as you're willing to make that step and you accept that, your quality of work goes up a huge amount, because you've got that prototype. And this is something that I'm learning in the sewing world, is I love just making it once, but you want to make it properly, you got to make your pattern, you've got to sew a prototype, then you've got to refit it, remake your pattern, redo it, then make your final one. And to me it's just like, but you just make the final one, it's fine, it's good. And then you're like, well, no, it's never going to be as good, and it's going to take you twice as long to do it that way if you just go through the correct steps. It's one of those things I'm constantly learning. It's like, oh, there's a reason why the people that do this for a living do it this way. And I hate to always admit it, but I mean, obviously sometimes it is difficult, like with resources. Sometimes you've only got one attempt at it. You can't buy 2 hides of leather. You've got to you want to try and do it right on the first time. But yeah, with something like this, there was no way I was not prototyping, because this was all scrap wood anyway, and I needed it, and it had to have a practical aspect to it. Like you couldn't not have it work, otherwise they'll just get thrown out. So yeah, it's definitely one of those things where prototyping it's an important step, as much as I really dislike it, but it's important. See, you either have to do a prototype, or you have to be willing to throw out the first thing you make, which is effectively the same thing. But yeah, you've got to kind of be in that mindset of, okay, whatever I'm going to make, I'm going to have to make 2 of, and then you kind of are accepting of that and you're willing to move on, because you can waste so much time on a prototype or on a project if you just like, oh, I have to make it work, I have to make it work, I have to make it work, and you're like, oh, I could have just remade that. I had an actual issue where I was making some drawer fronts, and I ended up like cutting it too short, and I was like, oh, maybe I can join it together and then re-edge it and stuff. I'm like, it's quicker for me to just remake the whole thing, and it was. And so I ended up remaking a whole bunch of drawer fronts rather than trying to rescue the ones that I'd kind of butchered. And it was just that willingness to move on and accept that, just like, nah, you've got to start again. And prototyping, I believe, is kind of like that next evolution of like, well, I'm not even going to bother trying to make it perfect. I'm going to get in there, figure it out, and go from there.
Yeah, and it really depends on the scope of the project you're working on. Like if I'm working on a new design, for a product that I know I'm going to replicate, then I will prototype the entire thing. I will make a prototype of that end product. But if I'm working on like a custom piece for a client and I just want to do something in it that's a little bit different or that I haven't done exactly that way before, then what I'll do is essentially prototype that process, and just try that out, just test that out on some scrap material to see, okay, have I thought of everything before I, start cutting up wood or metal? Or is there something that I didn't, that I overlooked in my thought process? That's a little bit easier for me to swallow than prototyping an entire piece.
Yeah, and what I find is that usually if you're like prototyping a specific joint or material, there's
I think I lost you.
Oh, you lost me. Are we back?
Yeah. Is it raining?
No, I don't know. It's perfectly clear out there. Yeah, okay. No, I think we got most of what you were just saying, so that's fine. I think we can just kind of keep on going. But yeah, no, and I guess what I was heading into is what I like to do is if I know I'm going to be prototyping a material or a joint or something, I usually find a project that I can use that prototype on, and then I can go from there. So like last year, I wanted to make I just got given that router. I had my pin nailer, like I had a whole bunch of new tools. So I was like, okay, I need a project to practice this on. So it's going to be a project for me. And so I made this kind of weird bonsai box thing that, has a whole bunch of drawers in it and things like that, just because it gave me an opportunity to test it on. And it's for me. So I'm happy with the result. If it's good or perfect or whatever, it doesn't matter. And then that way, when I get to the final piece, I've had a practice of those skills. So I do have a question for you though. How, given this problem of you want something to be able to sit a tile like that, what would your solution or what would your ideas be to try and solve that?
The place my head went immediately was very unoriginal. My head also went to, how do I replicate that Scrabble piece? The tile holders from a Scrabble board. Which essentially would be starting with rectangular stock. You would cut an angle on one of the short sides so that it sits back at an angle, and then remove another rectangular piece from the diagonal side of that, low spot kind of, so that you have your basic L shape. Then from there, I would take probably a rebate plane, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit here too, with what I've been working on. And you're going to remove kind of a tray in the crux of that L, in the corner of that L.
Yep.
And that's going to leave you with a raised piece, a raised lip at the front. Then to get that rounded over, what's called a bead on the front, like a Scrabble board, I would just use a hand plane, a Bead and Cove. So Bead and Cove hand planes actually come in sets. You can get a half set or a full set. They're pretty hard to find nowadays, but a bead will have a U-shaped iron, which results in a rounded over, convex surface. And a cove will have the opposite of that. So it'll be a plane that gives you a concave surface.
Yeah.
So I would use a bead hand plane to just take down the corners of that lip in the front and be left with a rounded piece. And I would do it the same way you did, as far as making one big long piece and then just hacking it up into the lengths I need.
Yeah. Because that was kind of my thoughts. It's like, maybe you could do this all with planes. But I was like, you either need to have a plane that's, specifically that full shape, like a molding plane or whatever those are called, which do have one somewhere. I don't even know where that is. But mine wouldn't have the correct shape to be able to do it, because that's how I imagine they make them industrially, is there's some kind of router or shape that basically they can do it. But why I'm specifically thinking of my parents' board, because the ones we have is actually an injected plastic. But yeah, no, it's fascinating, because like when you start breaking it down, it's like it's quite a few steps to make something like that, even though you think, well, industrially you'd make that in probably 1 or 2 steps. But yeah, so I do have to test this out and report back, but I think it'll work. And the nice thing is it does kind of stack up pretty compact. You can kind of like stack them together, which is kind of what I wanted to be able to fit in the bag. But enough about this. You mentioned planes, so I have a feeling I know what's sitting on your workbench. But Chili, what's on your workbench?
So what's on my workbench is this kerfing plane that I recently made, which it's kind of a misnomer, because it's not really a traditional plane, because a plane has an iron in it, which is a big chunky piece of steel that has a bevel on it, and so it's actually a wedge that you're using to remove material, whereas this kerfing plane has a saw blade in it, so it's really a saw with a fence. And so this is used to put thin kerfs into material. You can use it actually similarly to a rebate plane as well. Like if you want to take a rabbet out of the edge of a board, you can set this up to cut the kerf down, to a given depth, then cut from the edge and remove a rabbet from a piece. But I built it for a project to put kerfs in, because I built this little cabinet, which is for a client who is an avid golfer. And every time he goes to a new golf course, he picks up a ball marker from that golf course that says, what the place is. So all along the front of this, there's magnets. There's 50 magnets in total, so that you can stick a ball marker on the front. But then it's really hard to see. I don't know how I could give you any lighting that would show it, but on the top of each of these pieces, there's a kerf cut into the top, so that if you have a piece that if he picks up a ball marker that's not magnetic, or he just runs out of space, he gets more than 50, he could start putting them in the kerf in the top of these pieces too. So essentially, there's at least 100, spaces for at least 100 ball markers. So I had to have a way to put this kerf in, because it's very thin. It's a 1/16 of an inch. And you're not going to get a router bit that's going to do a 1/16 of an inch. It's just not good to have something that small spinning that fast. It's a recipe for disaster. So I built this kerfing plane for that. And what it essentially is it's a saw blade that's sandwiched between 2 pieces of wood. And I just used a really cheap saw blade, actually, from Harbor Freight, because that way I could leave the handle on it and use that to maneuver the plane, which is really nice. And then attached to the side of this composite of wood and metal is a fence. So the fence can be moved out on these threaded rods to whatever distance I need it to be, and lock it in. And then it sticks below the level of the saw blade, so that I have a nice flat perpendicular surface to what I'm cutting, that I can register that up against the piece and cut a nice kerf.
Couple of I guess we interrupted your nice spiel going on there, but First question is, I didn't realize Harbor Freight sold saws that had a nice handle like that. I thought that'd all be like cheap, nasty injected plastic.
It's not a great handle, and it's not a great saw, but I was not going to punch holes in a really nice saw until I knew that I had proof of concept. Um, so overall, it does work pretty well, but there's some things that I do want to change in it. And that would be that one, I need to get a better saw blade, most definitely. And when I do that, I'll probably get a fairly inexpensive saw again and then recut the teeth myself. Because the teeth on this there is no gullet between the teeth. And since you're sawing a kerf, an enclosed space, you need somewhere for that material to go. So I'd like to have a saw that has more of a rip cut pattern to the teeth that I can put a deeper gullet on. That would be really nice. And then right now I just have holes, singular holes punched through the saw blade. And what I'd like to do is elongate those into slots. That way I can change the depth of my saw blade and let this piece of oak here on either side of the blade, that'll be my depth stop. That would be really nice. And then the other thing that I would like to do is probably ditch this threaded rod. I'm not a huge fan of this. It's really cumbersome and a total pain to change the distance of the fence. So I think what I'd like to do is probably put a bushing, like a brass bushing, and seat it into the fence and have it come out past the fence to where I can drill it and tap it and put a lock screw on it and do that on both of these, and then swap out the threaded rod for solid bar stock. Because that way I can just undo those locking screws and slide the whole fence assembly a lot more smoothly, a lot more quickly, and then lock it back down. I mean, the nice thing is this isn't going anywhere. Once I have it set up, it is locked in there until I put a wrench on it.
Yeah. So is there just a nut on the other side of that oak fence then?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just locking it in there. Yeah.
Yeah, there's in here, there's another nut and washer. So there's 2 nuts and washers on this, which pinch the saw blade, and then there's 2 on this, which immobilize the fence.
Okay, so yeah, to move that one, you've got to undo those outer bolt, slide it out, undo the inner one, move it in, then realize it's not square, and then redo it. And
yeah, it's a bit cumbersome, but it does work. This is basically a prototype.
Yeah. Prototype until it needs to be replaced, kind of thing.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, you said something that made me think of, you like to make the stuff for your hobbies. I love making tools. Like, that's one of my favorite things to make, especially when I'm making tools for other craft workers, because I know they're going to get used. I know, one of the tenets for my business and my shop is everything has to be functional. I don't make wall art.
Yeah.
I make things that function. And it's interesting that you said we're going to talk about some bookbinding later, because I actually made some tools for a friend of mine that is a bookbinder. And those are really fun too.
And I'll tell you people how to not do it correctly.
Yeah, the thing that gets me is that tools are incredibly expensive. Like, there are other people that make tools, for woodworkers and craft workers and stuff, but these book presses, for instance, that I made for a friend of mine, they were not terribly expensive to make. The materials were minimal, the labor was pretty minimal, and so I think I want to say I charged them like $125 each, they were like $300 anywhere else.
Yep.
And I was like, this is highway robbery.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, it's the problem with tools is like the more specialized the skill and more specialized that technique in that hobby, like bookbinding isn't a particularly big hobby, I would say. I mean, there's definitely people that do out there, but most people do it kind of like me. They kind of like enjoy making it, and you can make do with, you don't need to have all the fancy tools. And so when you do kind of make that step and you want to get those tools, because it's such a confined market, because you've got on one side all the industrial commercial side that are got all their $1,000 machines doing it on an industrial scale. You've got the people on my side which are just using a drill and some C clamps, and then you've got those people that are in the middle that kind of want to bridge that gap and kind of step up their game. And yeah, it's a really terrifying step when you do that, because you're like, oh, I've got to make this investment, but it doesn't make any logical sense to make that investment. But then you have passions and you just go, nope, I'm gonna have to do it. But yeah, making tools is something that I haven't quite bridged the gap into. I mean, my skill set isn't quite there yet, and B, I haven't needed to. But I feel sometimes it's getting on the edge of like, oh, I'm starting to need something that I just can't find at a reasonable price. And then, yeah, heading down that route. I mean, I think my first step will be doing restoration of tools, because I do have a couple planes that do need to be cleaned up and working in better condition.
That is a really, really good way to do it. And one of the reasons I like that is that picking up old tools and restoring them, you're going to find designs that you're not going to find in a modern tool anymore. And some of that's a real shame, because there are some really ingenious ideas in old tools. So that's definitely something. I have a ton of planes that I have been restoring and working on, and I've got my plow plane here because it is really similar to the kerf plane, but the difference is you can see right there in this one, this is the iron that cuts the dado or groove in the piece, and it's much wider than a 1/16 of an inch.
Yeah.
But I really love, I looked at this and kind of picked it apart and saw how the fence moved and stuff like that, and helped inspire my design for my kerfing plane.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've got mine here. I love this thing. Love it.
They're just cool. Like, for one, they're just cool.
Yeah, they just
but two, you can feel the story when you work with them. Like, it's obviously not, some cheap tool from Harbor Freight or somewhere like that. Even big box, stores like Home Depot or Lowe's, or in some areas of our country, we have Menards. They sell pretty crappy tools. Like, they'll get your one project done, but they're not going to be long lasting. They're not going to be super great. There's a big difference. And when you put an old tool like that in your hands, you just instantly feel like you're better at what you're doing.
Yeah, the tools do make you better. It's like you don't want to let the tools down. You're like, I know you can do this well, so I better get up my game.
I have no excuse for this to turn out poorly.
I can't blame my tools. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll get into it when we talk about some more sewing projects down the line, but I just recently purchased a 1953 sewing machine, and I haven't had a chance to really use it yet, but oh man, just feeling that. I mean, it's a much better machine than the one I used to use, but oh man, that thing just feels solid. And the guy I bought it off, it was off, well, in Australia we call Gumtree, but it's the same as Craigslist. And he used to be a machinist for Singer back in like 1960 to 1980. So he basically fully pulled it apart, and you walk into his workshop and he's got all of these sewing machines that he's, pulling apart, rebuilding. And yeah, it's just one of those things where I look at that and I'm just like, it has to be used properly. I can't abuse it like I do the other one. So the other one's obviously got to stick around for when I've got those projects. But yeah, it's one thing that I've learned, that I've with my making journey, I've started off with cheap tools or tools that I've been given, and then I've kind of slowly upped my tools. And to be honest, I feel like it's almost, I mean, obviously you want to have safe tools. You don't want to go and buy an unsafe tool for sure. But when I get a new tool now, I definitely appreciate it. And I think that 5-10 years ago, if I'd been given that tool, I wouldn't have appreciated what that tool is doing for my skills and for that final piece that I'm working on, as much as I do now. Because now I kind of like, now that I've been sewing on a crappy machine for 10 years or 8 years or however long it's been, I used to use that machine, and I know exactly why it's good. I know exactly why it's better. And then I can make the most of it. And it's the same with some of the, like when I picked up that plow plane tool for the first time and I was using that, it was the real first time I used a tool like that, but having not really used anything like that and kind of faked it with saws and cutting grooves and things like that, having that tool that could do that job, it was just like mind blowing of like, oh, this makes life so much easier and it does such a better job. And yeah, it's just one of those things that it's that paradox, is you want to tell people get the right tool, but then you want to tell people, well, don't not do it because you don't have that exact tool. You can do it with another tool. It'll just not quite be as good, and you'll work up to that tool. And kind of my strategy is buy the cheaper tool, figure out if you're going to use it until it breaks, and then go and buy the proper one, or go and invest in it, or do kind of what you said, pick up a secondhand one and restore it. And as you're restoring it, you will learn about that tool and you'll get familiar with that. And kind of like we spoke about in the last episode, it's like I pretty much use my cheap things to destruction. And if they do survive, I'll rebuild them. And, you know, at that point, I've understood their history.
Yeah. So speaking of quality tools, the other thing that I have here in front of me, and that I see behind you, that is, I'm going to apologize right now because this is probably going to send you down a rabbit hole, and this may be a project that you pick up. So I want to talk about this.
Oh no.
This is a very, very simple piece of wood that I'm holding up for anybody who can't see. It's a rectangle that's been cut at a 45 through the middle of it. And this is half of what is called a French cleat system. And a French cleat is a way of hanging things, as opposed to the beautiful wall of pegboard that is behind Andrew. Now, when I grew up, I used to make fun of my dad because our entire garage and every house we were in, like the first thing he did was like cover the whole thing in pegboard. And like you could see the outline of stuff. You know, if you took it off the wall, you knew exactly where it went because you could see the outline. Nothing ever moved. It was always in the same place. So this cabinet that I made, I actually made it to hang via French cleat. And it's a really nice, super sturdy way to hang something instead of, trying to use wire or anything like that. The really cool thing is that you can hold this cleat up to the wall with a level, get it level, attach it to the wall, and you know that when you hang this cabinet on it, your cabinet's going to be level.
Assuming you got your cleat straight on your thing you're hanging.
Yeah. So, I mean, I did it on this piece because I wanted it to stick off the wall.
Yeah.
Because it gives a piece kind of some interesting depth. But we're gonna go on a short field trip here, so you can see it, and anybody who happens to be watching this on YouTube can see it. But if we go over into my build shop, you can see. So I've got a whole wall that's French cleats.
See, people look. If you pause right here, if you look at the two screens, you can see the difference between a maker and a craftsman or craftsperson.
But what's really fun is that you're not restricted to the stuff you can buy at the store for pegboard. Like you can make all your own stuff. So like I made something to hang my mallets from and my chisels, and I've got all my like marking gauges and stuff like that. Like it's really nice because you can customize it any way you want. And like I've got a cabinet that I made for my drill driver and drill bits, which are outside because I'm working on a project outside today. But like a sandpaper cabinet, even the stuff that I use, like this is my shooting board. And so it hangs up here nicely. And then I've got a crosscut board. Like it's super nice. Not just nice tools, but nice ways to organize your tools and have them at the ready. That's another really huge thing that I've discovered since we moved into our current location and my current shop, which is way different. It's a much smaller space. I have to use it wisely. Our last house, I had 1,000 square foot garage, and that was really to my detriment because my shop was heinous. It was so bad. And I'm really glad that we're in this space now, because eventually when we move again and I have a more appropriate dedicated workshop again, I'm going to lay that out so much better than I did my first shop.
Yeah, no, and so my iteration is I started off in the, well, what was it? It was in the basement, and it was in the like the utility room, and it was literally the only spot that I had, and I had one wall, and I think back then I didn't even have a pegboard. And then my next house was the one in Denver where it was the car garage. That one was pretty good, but it was pretty old and janky. And then kind of moved into like a single garage space. I existed in a couple of those, and now this is actually by far my best workshop that I've ever had. And it's actually needs to come down and be rebuilt because there's a lot of dry rot and stuff like that. And so there are plans to replace these, but for those of you that are just starting, for me, it was to get them up on the wall was revolutionary. So I've got a couple toolboxes, and that's where, you know, growing up, my dad had all these tools in the toolbox. So you put tools in your toolbox, and I hated it. You can't find anything in the toolbox. You've got to dig through things. Things get messed up. And so getting it all up on the wall where you can see it is one of the things. And it's a bit of a mess up there, but at least I can see it. And usually what happens is I get a new tool and it's like, oh, that needs to go up on the wall. If I move a little bit, you can see that I've just started hanging whatever, wherever, more to just get it up and out of the toolboxes so I can see it. And it's definitely not in an ideal location. It's actually in the corner of my shop, so I've got to like walk all the way around my workbench to get to it. But I do have plans to update and restore and fix and organize and do better, because there are some tools up there that just don't need to be up there anymore, and they can go in a better location where I've got new tools. Because it's always a problem with any kind of permanent storage system, which obviously with your system it's not a permanent, you can adjust, is you're adding tools and tools break and you're replacing and things like that. And so it's like I've got a pneumatic tool section over there, and I've got like all my wrenches over somewhere else, and my power tools are all under my workbench. So yeah, I think when I start working on some of those projects, we'll definitely be able to have some discussions about tool organization and storage, because it is a huge one. And it's like having a clear workbench, having a clear access to your tools. And it's, again, referencing Adam Savage, he calls it, what is it, first step retrievability or one step retrievability. Is basically the ability to just grab a tool without having to go under or over or in something. First order retrievability, that's what he calls it. And I think that's such a great term, especially for tools that you just need to have on hand, like screwdrivers or pliers, where you don't need to dig for them. You know, something like my soldering iron, you know, I don't need that as a first grab. but something like a hacksaw, yeah, you need to be able to grab that because you never know when you're going to use it. So, but let's not go down that rabbit hole of tool storage yet. But
yeah, so I think that's probably a good place to wrap for this week. But I'm really curious, do you have any teasers for us about what you might be bringing to the table next week?
I think it may be a book binding. I don't know. We'll see. We've got another kind of long weekend, public holiday this weekend, so things could dissolve into various other projects. So yeah, I think it's been a while since I've bound a book. It's been a good 3 or 4 months, so it's time to bind one up again. I think that might be what we're talking about. But we'll do a bit of a swing on it from my normal book binding that I do. So how about yourself? I heard you sound busy, so you get to pick and choose what you talk about.
You froze in a really delightful position on my screen. It was pretty hilarious.
Always good.
I'm not sure what I'll bring to the table exactly next week, but I'm thinking it's probably going to be a slab built bench that I'm working on for a client. I think we might talk about that.
Awesome. So, Chili, where can people find more of you on the internet?
Yes, if you would like to see more of what I'm up to, you can follow me on Facebook at Orwood Solutions or on YouTube at the same handle, or on Instagram at OrwoodCS. And as always, my website, orwoodsolutions.com. Andrew, how about you?
So, as usual, you can find me on the YouTubes. That's the best place to find me, or at craftybeetroot.com. And for more information about the podcast, you should be able to find this on all of the main players, Apple Podcasts, things like that. Obviously, this is on YouTube. If you search for whatsonyourworkbench.com, what's on your workbench on YouTube, this should come up. And then the website for the podcast is what's on your workbench .podbean.com, I believe. So I know last week we spoke a little bit about possibly having to change the name. At the moment, I think we'll just leave it for now, and we'll just kind of deal with that because we're amateurs. I'm not a craftsperson of podcasts. So yeah, if you search for us, you'll find us. As always, subscribe, leave reviews, all of that good stuff. We appreciate it. Any questions, comments, leave it in any of those various spots, and I think we'll be able to find it. So with that, we will find out what's on your workbench next week. Talk to you later.